This is the monthly Verify Testing internal customer call or internal stakeholder call. We're going to go with the same format we did last month, where instead of walking through the entire deck, I've called out or linked to it in the agenda and specifically linked to the epics and active development slide, where most of the things have changed. You can jump into categories from there and look at more specific changes. But the couple of things I wanted to call out on this call are I closed out earlier this week the actionable accessibility data epic. So we just wrapped up. Juan actually just closed the issue or put the last interview notes into the issue yesterday for maturity scorecard interviews for the new accessibility feature set. And so we're pretty excited about that. We're going to be discussing later this week what that means from a maturity standpoint. The guidance is still kind of leans on the designer and the product manager to make a call as to what level of maturity a feature or a category is at. So we're going to have a debate about is it at minimal or is it at viable today. So I'll make a category maturity change hopefully later this week there. And then one of the other epics that the team is currently working on is around group code coverage. So this is building on a feature that will actually be releasing in 13.1, which is a graph of code coverage for an individual project. We'll be kind of rolling that data up for groups and making it accessible at the group level. And we're going to iterate through that much in the same way we did with that first feature of data for a single project, with just giving you the data as a downloadable CSV first, and then an actual display of a table, being able to pick your projects, and then ultimately a graph. I'm going to caveat this with there's probably going to end up being discussion within that issue and epic about the code coverage value isn't very indicative of anything because we're just taking the average. We further discussed that in some other places. We know it's probably not what some people may consider right, but ultimately, where we've landed is we don't think we're going to get to something that makes everybody happy without watering it down to something that's just valuable to no one. So instead, what we're going to try to do is continue to evolve the feature set in a way that gives people access to data that is meaningful. Things like code coverage reports, pulling code coverage data back into the web IDE, feature set or features like that we think just are much more valuable. This is just something to say directionally, we know that we're going in the right way for code coverage value. So those are the two that I wanted to call out. Oh, and I missed my point of why I'm calling out the group code coverage. There are designs within there. I've linked to the design tab, and we're soliciting feedback. I've gone back to the customers that we did the problem validation with to point them at the design and say, hey, we'd love to get your take on this workflow, especially for picking the projects that you want data for or want a graph for, and then can dig into. But we'd love to get our internal customer feedback as well on that design. So feel free to pop in there and leave comments within the issue or within the design itself on the design tab. So those are the two things I wanted to call out for active epics in development today. And then looking forward, the next thing up in the validation track for me is test history display. So the direction that I think we want to go first is building on our test report or JUnit report within the pipeline view, and then extending that into the MR widget as a next step. But as we look at the history of tests that have run, as I'm starting to think forward into this, there's a couple of places we could pull that history from. Is this test execution just for that branch? Is this test execution just for the default branch? Is this that test execution from anywhere within the project? And so I think we have time today to have a bit of a synchronous discussion about some pros and cons to those approaches, so that at least I can start to flesh out an issue and we can further the discussion there asynchronously. So gonna open it to the group and we'll take notes in the doc as well. Approaches that you've seen in the past that have worked well for this kind of thing. I've been looking at some different plugins or different competitive offerings, so I can provide some insight there as far as what I think we should do, but wanted to open it up to the group.
Sure. For me, as an engineer, I think that if I'm thinking about test history, what I want to get out of that is, can I tell if a test is flaky and I need to refactor it? The other thing I want to get at, which test is actually catching stuff. Like this is a good test. It frequently catches problems. And when I think about those, it doesn't necessarily make sense to do it from like the default branch or the master branch, because then you've already had those problems and you've solved them and you're merged into master, more or less, right? So the way that I think about it is like you probably want the history of every merge request test run in order to get the best guess on those.
So that would be every test execution across the project, regardless of pipeline, or regardless of branch, rather.
Regardless of branch, but only if it's a merge request. So like, I'm not sure. I think there's a distinction to be made there, but I'm not.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think history there would definitely tell you that there's may or may not be a problem in whatever code there is that test is testing. Doing it from a merge request, individual branch. What were you envisioning, Ricky, as to history? Because branches are rather short-lived, right? So were you just comparing it? Were you just going to glump all the different branches together? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, kind of. I was thinking it's more like aggregate test run history rather than, okay, this is the history for the default branch, or this is the history for another branch. It's just kind of, if you have that aggregate history, the thing that we're thinking about, or at least I had a conversation with Drew about this, where if we can tell that this is the test that's most likely to fail, maybe we can pull that out into a job that runs quick before all the rest of the jobs run, that just kind of asserts that it passes. And then if it fails, we can bail on the whole pipeline and save a bunch of CI minutes.
Yeah. So you're thinking by looking at history, we can look and say over the last 50 executions of all of the tests, these ones fail at least half the time, pull all of them out, run them first, or run them in parallel. That way we can end that pipeline sooner. Interesting. Okay.
I love where this discussion is going. I added a few links there. We have a process for to define a reliable test. And that is like highly stable, highly valuable test that guards against every deploy. And when a test is gone into a reliable state, it blocks the deployment to staging, pre-prod, and also production, because that's it's earned its value in time. So currently the count here is manual, and it's very tedious on our end. Engineers just keep track of the tests in their area. Hey, it failed like once every month, and that's I think it's fine. And we triage it that way. So this feature would help greatly. Another comment I want to add is I resonate with Ricky, where I think the configuration should be flexible enough that it should be able to work outside of an MR. Meaning, because the way we run tests, the same test that runs on an MR, we also run it on other configurations, say the omnibus packages, staging and pre-prod, and those are run on a different instance. So I think the simple iteration is, don't worry about linking it back to MRs right now. Just have that history, that context within that pipeline configuration. We can link to the MRs later. That will at least unlock us to look at the history of the test runs per environment, or per configuration, per project. I think the right term is per project. So if that is available, then it will help us greatly. And while I hear feedback from the team, I'll try to find the pipelines in the ops instance that we run tests on staging and pre-production.
Great.
So let's see.
Yeah, that would solve a current issue that we have within quality with us trying to track, especially when we have a flaky test, we pull it out and we're trying to watch things over time, and it's, we can have an issue open for weeks and weeks on a test right now that maybe failed once, and we decided not to quarantine it, but not having that fuller history of really seeing where it's happening, it's harder because we go through and like Mick was saying, we manually go look at all of the pipelines and try to capture where those failures occur, and that's a completely manual process right now. And having the count would definitely benefit us in resolving that sort of issue and bubbling up the priority for tests that might be flakier than we realize.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about, because I was thinking about the first step would be go with just the default branch. But like you say, by the time you're running tests there, they're probably stable. As I was thinking about that, I was like, well, we want to know it's normally a stable test when it runs. This failure must be related to something I've done. If instead it's this test is failing across a bunch of different branches, to me, then I would think about that as it's just a flaky test or it's a test that needs more work. So I'm just going to skip it as opposed to, oh, it's impacted, my change has impacted that test result. So that's why I was thinking about using default branch first, but it makes a lot of sense to look at look at it across all of the different branches that are out there. Excellent. Well, I will.
I thought of
ahead,
that.
Ricky.
Actually, sorry. One of the things that's coming up is looking at only putting the failures in the pipeline page by default. And so if we get that done, I think part of that work is also going to be to create a smaller artifact. I'm not sure if that's going to end up being JSON or a smaller JUnit.xml file. However, the implementation works out isn't what's important. But if we do end up with that smaller artifact and we can make an API endpoint for that smaller artifact, then you might be able to go and get all the failures for all the tests really easily and cheaply, and then kind of make your own data aggregation from that.
Bingo. Thank you, Ricky. I'm going to share this link. If the whole group here wants access to look at the pipelines on ops.gitlab.net, we are more than happy to share. So this is the test that run on staging. And the test here also resides in the MRs, though some of it can be run, some of it doesn't need to be run. This is where we want to see where the tests are flaky. And you can see that the tests are here, that we have smoke tests. You can see the reliable tests are here. There's 36 of them. So having that historical data in this context unlocks a lot of things. And when it's done here, we can consider if it's going to be an addition to the MRs later in the pipeline. But I think putting it at the pipeline level makes total sense. I'll copy the link over and share it over.
And if you'd be willing to share your screen again, Nook, I'd be interested to hear from you and Zaf as users of that page. What would the user experience, what would you expect the user experience to be? Like, what is your next step in going to look for history of a test? So it doesn't look like we have failed tests here, but if we imagine that one of the tests had a failure and you were looking at that history, what would your steps be?
Well, let's find one that has a failure and see where we can go from there.
As I subtly change this into a user interview.
This is a bigger one. So
look how fast that page loaded, though.
I think the context should be extrapolated out. I think adding historical data here isn't. It needs to be extrapolated out because each pipeline is different. Like some of the tests might run in this pipeline, some of the tests might run in not in the next pipeline, but the next pipeline. So I think it has to be a parent of the pipelines because you're looking at occurrences of the same tests in multiple pipelines. Does that make sense? It might not make sense, and it's fine.
Yeah, I'm not quite following.
Okay, because say if you open let's open two pipelines, right? So this looks great, right? A lot of things are passing. Ooh, interesting. But these are passing, right? And then if they have things here that are failing, how I think the historical view should be pointing to different pipelines because you need the data from different pipelines.
Okay.
it's not like you're already in a pipeline that's just a snapshot in time, but the historical is multiple snapshots in time.
Okay.
That rolls up to like, hey, this test within like the last 50 pipelines, how often has it failed, or how often has it passed? I think that needs to be extrapolated out. I'm not going to prescribe whether it should be at this level, but I think that information should be one level higher than the list of pipelines as
Gotcha.
an aggregate roll-up view.
It makes
Yeah.
sense. It makes sense to link to it from here, right? We could go to it, but we need a location that shows us the overview per pipeline and not just this particular pipeline's view of it.
I think that makes sense. It's going to be a bit of a technical challenge to do that because of the way that tests are modeled. So we really have just the file-based artifacts for the tests. We don't have a database representation or a Rails model with a database backing for each individual test. So in order to get that historical view, we're going to have to do something clever. And I think that for the first kind of pass at this, it might not have all the functionality that we're looking for, but for the code coverage, for example, we have the ability to roll up daily summaries of the code coverage reports per build group. And I'm kind of thinking maybe there's something we can do similarly or use the same table or the same kind of approach with the tests to come up with some historical insights that are valuable, but they might not be as granular as this specific test in this specific suite is an issue until we solve some of the problems around actually being able to model and store a lot of very granular test specific data in the database, because that's pretty expensive. A lot of these JUnit reports are like 200 megabytes and they run on every pipeline. And so you can imagine that persisting that kind of data in a database on an ongoing basis is an engineering challenge.
I see. Would a small iteration be if we click on the latest pipeline and there's a test, you show like maybe the historical failure for that? Are you thinking in terms of that, or is it am I grokking at a different term here? Like, for example, if you think that presenting the information here is easier, would that help, or would the underlying work for new data models render that mute anyways?
Yeah, I think that Camille and others have voiced the opinion that they want to avoid modeling it in the database as much as possible. And basically they want to try everything else before it comes to actually making a database table called unit tests and then tracking tests by name.
Got it. Okay.
I think that the iteration will likely look like we'll make an endpoint and you can get the reports for all the failures for all the pipeline runs, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And then once we kind of see how we can use that, maybe look at how we can pull that back into the application in an intelligent way in order to kind of get more insight into this pipeline view or into the parent of the pipeline view, like you were mentioning.
Got it. Okay. So we sorry, let me get this thought out here before I forget. So you mentioned that the current approach is to provide an API endpoint to pull some data on a time series dimension, and then we could render it in some shape or form. So it's not persisting data, it's more like we're going to have some type of intelligence, and it's going to be dynamically calculated on the fly based on these new endpoints. Is that correct?
Not quite. I'm thinking about because the approach that we're going to have to take is to persist only failures. And if you can go and get the little failure reports for each of the test suites that ran, then we could aggregate that in some way and come up with a different report based on all of the failures that have happened over time. So
right.
The endpoint, all it would return would be for this build or this job, these are the tests that failed. And then from there, you can build something up from that in order to get a little bit more historical analysis. And that would be, I think that would be the smallest thing we could do.
Got it. Is that piece something we have to build, or do you think it's going to be like a report generation button, like a historical report generation button in the product?
I don't know. That's a really great question. What do you think?
I think we're on the same page here on where how the data is being rolled up. I think what's missing is at the top, where is it going to be a sidecar where users like create a customized pipeline, pull these reports and dump like a CSV, or is it going to have what I said, where it's going to be dynamically calculated on the fly, where you're going to have like a button that says generate flaky report, give it a time series, and then you're going to render something that's doesn't have to be persistent, but it's like this page will only show when you request it, and then that lessens the load on having to come up with a new data model for historical reasons. It's just something that gets calculated, maybe output as a CSV for the team, and that's good enough. I don't think we need to come up with really fancy dashboards in the first iteration. Just that's my feedback. It doesn't have to be a prescription.
And I just wanted to clarify too. My comments earlier too were more in general, thinking a little bit broader. We've kind of worked around trying to figure out like flakiness from a historical standpoint. Mark did some excellent work in connecting our test cases repo to our pipelines through a script where we're actually updating failures on specific tests. So we do get some sort of history along those lines, but it's definitely useful and a step in the right direction. But having some sort of history laid out a little bit cleaner for us would definitely be good. But I understand Camille's concern too about not wanting to load up the database, because that's probably the biggest risk in trying to track test data. If you look at like some of the open source test case repository, test tracking software that's out there, the biggest problems with it ends up being performance, because of just how much data you end up storing over time. So
Yep.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard problem to solve.
So it sounds like it sounds like instead of the workflow being going from the pipeline view to this test page to an individual test and looking at its history, we would solve the problem that y'all are having by rolling the data up and presenting it somewhere else, maybe outside of the context of the pipeline, and saying across the pipelines that have ran, here are the tests that are failing, so that you get that history view. And if providing that data through just a data dump, a CSV first, that would be a nice iterative step, as opposed to the script that you have today that goes back in and updates issues.
Cool. Yes.
All right, seeing a thumbs up, so that's awesome to validate.
That nails it right on the head. I think for let's just show how it's being captured right now. It's not pretty, but this is where what I mean by the historical context. So let's pick one of the tests.
Go to 810.
810.
Yeah.
810. 810.
It's a monitor with Prometheus. You want me to share my screen?
Oh, sure. You want if you share your screen.
So we have this particular test, and every time we get a failure, we're dumping those results into here, and as a result, adding particular tags in here, labels, to indicate where we found it. Is there anything in particular here you wanted me to highlight, Mac?
No, this is great. Thank you, Seth. So the current, what we're trying to do right now is actually look at the API label events for like 5 of the test case or 10 of the test case that we want to see, and basically count the number of times failed in staging or failed in nightly has been applied to the test, and that's like the historical stability. That what we just described just now is this exact same mechanism, but inside this as a feature where instead of us writing those roll-up stuff, it would just be however mechanism, like a dynamic report generation that gives us a CSV, and that will already moves us a major steps ahead of what we have right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, so us calculating that while we can see the failures, what Mech is indicating is it's still manual for us to go through and add these up and try to figure out just how flaky is it. Yeah, I can see it's failed quite a bit, but over time, what is the time? You got to go through and map all that out.
Excellent. Thank you for the rich discussion on that topic, folks.
Sorry if I didn't capture everybody's thoughts in typing. I think I got like 70% of it. So
thank you for taking notes, Ricky. Appreciate that. All right. Any other closing thoughts on that topic, or are we ready to move on? All right. I didn't have anything else on the agenda. I did want to just follow up from the last call. There was a great discussion on running end-to-end tests locally. An issue was opened by the quality folks to enable development engineers to run a subset of those end-to-end tests locally before merging. If you had any other thoughts on that topic, feel free to drop them into the issue. Or if there's anything we want to discuss here today synchronously, by all means, let's jump into that discussion. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up unless there are other agenda items that we want to add on the fly.
I'll need time to review the new issue. Thanks to the team that put this up and give feedback back to the team.
Yeah, it's a short issue, Mac, and honestly, James, in a nutshell, I think it's just going to be resolved by some documentation, maybe in the template update, like you suggested.
Cool. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time. And I'll give everybody a couple of minutes back.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Love the collaboration. It's awesome.
Yeah. Cheers.
Talk soon. Bye.
bye.